Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jennifer LaRue, and on behalf of the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, I'm very tickled to be hosting this program featuring Laura Thompson, the author of the book, The Lives of the $1 Million Babies, Heiresses, and the Mark Twain House and Museum's Executive Director, Pieter Roos. I'll introduce them more fully in just a moment. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I have been hosting these programs for the Twain House for close to 2 years now. And every so often we do one at noontime, usually because one of our speakers is not in the same time zone. And that's certainly the case today. Laura is just outside London, about 40 miles outside London, England. And she has warned us that there's a storm a-brewing there. And so her internet connection may be a little unstable. So please bear with us. And remember that that's kind of part of the fun and adventure of these virtual programs. So I'm not going to talk for very long because I know you're not here to listen to me talk. First, I would like to thank you for participating in the chat. I see you all telling us where you're from and that kind of thing. Please continue to do that. That is one of the real benefits of the virtual programs. So know that this program is being recorded, and the chat remains live even after the program is done. So if you make a friend here or want to continue a conversation, you can find the program again, either by following the same link you used to register just now, or going to the Mark Twain House and Museum's website, marktwainhouse.org, and going to the virtual programs page. However, if you have a question, we're going to do a brief question and answer session toward the end of today's program. Rather than post that in the chat, if you could do me the favor of placing it at the bottom of your screen where you see the Ask a Question area, that will make it much easier for me to manage that part of the program when the time comes. And another great thing there is you can look at the questions that other people have posted and see if you have the same one, and you can upvote it and thus bring it to the top of the pile, making it more likely to be asked. So while we're looking at that part of the screen, if you could just raise your gaze a tiny bit to that long green bar that says, "Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here." I know that the Mark Twain House is very grateful for anything any of you is able to do in terms of financial support, particularly if you do value this virtual programming, just today's or the whole slate of programs that the museum has offered through the pandemic. Know that most of the time the museum has not charged admission or registration fee for the programs, but they do cost money to produce. And so if you feel that you can help defray that cost by making a donation of any size, let me just tell you that the staff and the board of trustees of the museum are committed to making every penny count, and every single penny is deeply appreciated. So thank you for your help in that regard. Toward the top of the chat, and I think we can probably repost it now that so many of you are chiming in, is a link through which you can purchase your own copy of Heiresses. And now we're no dummies. We know that you can purchase this book elsewhere, but please know that if you do purchase it through that link, you'll be buying it straight from the Mark Twain House and Museum, and your purchase supports the museum and benefits the museum. So please consider doing that if you're able. So having said all that, I just have a little bit of thanking to do. First, I want to start with our sponsors. Today's program, like all of our virtual programs, is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by our media sponsor, Connecticut Public, WNPR. Very grateful for their ongoing support. The program is produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord. I think Frank would have really loved today's program. He was a longtime, very much loved and valued trustee of the museum who passed away last year, and we're very pleased to be able to honor his memory through these programs. I'd like to introduce our guests now. Pieter Roos is the executive director of the Mark Twain House and Museum, and he, having been the longtime director of the Newport Restoration Foundation in Newport, Rhode Island, knows a thing or two about heiresses. He'll be in conversation, of course, with Laura Thompson, who won the Somerset Mom Award for her first book, The Dogs. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Six, the lives of the Mitford sisters. Other books of hers include the critically acclaimed Life in a Cold Climate, which is a biography of Nancy Mitford, which so many of us have read and loved, and Agatha Christie, A Mysterious Life, which was nominated for an Edgar Allan Poe Award in 2019. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a great big Mark Twain House and Museum welcome to Laura Thompson and director Pieter Roos. And bear with me, please. It takes me just a second to bring them up on screen fully. Oops, that didn't go right. There we go. And let me just welcome them first. Peter and Laura, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I'm so looking forward to your conversation. And as I said, there's going to be Q&A at the end. Peter, will you let me know when it's time for me to pop back on screen and help with that, please?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm going to sit back and enjoy with everybody else. And thank you again. See you in a little bit.
Laura, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today from across the pond. We really appreciate it, and this is a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's full of fascinating stories and fascinating insights. So I think I'll start the way I often start with, what was your inspiration for doing this particular subject matter?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for having me here. I only wish I could be there in person, but
I wish you could too.
Another time, I hope. How did this book come about? Kind of by a bit of an odd process, really. I was actually commissioned to write something else. And in the course of researching this other book, I was reading all the people that we, the letters of Nancy Mitford, which are almost a Bible to me. I just adore them. And other people from that era, Cecil Beaton, Evelyn Waugh, James Lees-Milne, the usual suspects. And these names kept coming up at me. Daisy Fellows, the niece of Winnaretta Singer, the sewing machine heiress. Daisy, who used to cross herself in gratitude whenever she saw a sewing machine in a shop window, because that was her money. People like Emerald Cunard, who had come from San Francisco and reinvented herself as the queen of London society. And of course, Barbara Hutton, who occurs quite frequently in Nancy Mitford's letters. And I thought, oh, hang on. These women are incredibly interesting. Of course, they've been written about before. I mean, it would be crazy for me to claim I'm the first person to write a book about Consuelo Vanderbilt. But I thought a more thematic look at heiresses, going right back to the 17th century, which is where my book begins, and what money does to people and what money does to women in particular. And then this kind of subtext emerged of a march toward some semblance of gender equality, and how women, money and women, sort of the interplay of it, and how that changed with time. So a kind of something started to emerge that became interesting. But I will say now, it's the hardest book I've ever done. It was very, very hard.
Yeah, there's so many of them, and they do span such a broad swath of history. And certainly there are things that heirs and heiresses share in common, but the heiresses have a lot more problems, and there's no doubt about that. And I would like to go back to that 17th and 18th century period. First of all, it's one of my favorite periods. I've spent a lot of time studying it throughout my career. But the lack of equality, you always know that women are looked at as chattel in the 16th century and in the 15th century, and even well into the 19th. But you don't realize just how extraordinarily that is the case until you read about some of these heiresses. So let's talk about Mary Davies, or Mary Bowes, who you talk about a lot, and just the kind of trials that they faced, including kidnapping and essentially imprisonment and forced marriage. Let's talk about that for a while.
Well, I'm really glad to talk about that, because my fear with this book, although it's a really enticing subject, was that it would become a kind of Hello magazine. You know, who had the biggest, who had the biggest yacht, who had the biggest diamond. You know, I was really anxious to avoid that. So by taking it back in time, and as I say, taking this almost feminist slant on it, that women, when they had no protection in law, their money had no protection either, and how. Certainly in this country, not until the late 19th century did that change. We had something called the Married Women's Property Acts, which you also had in America, which meant that when you married, the man didn't automatically get everything. You know, there was one legal identity, and it was him once you got married. So Mary Davies, who was my starting point, because this was a story that had always fascinated me. I've always been fascinated, living in London, as I've done since, you know, like the 90s, by the fact that a woman, once all the men had died, as Julian Fellows said, you only get an heiress when all the men have died. But once all the men, he would know, once you get these young girls, once everyone else had died, who would inherit what were fields in the middle of what is now prime real estate of London. Mary Davies, who was born in 1665, and I say she is the winner in a real life game of Monopoly. She inherited, she was the great niece of a moneylender who had bought 1,000 acres in the middle of what is now Belgravia, Grosvenor Square, where the American embassy used to be. Belgravia, with these glorious sort of vanilla ice cream colored squares where aristocrats and prime ministers and everybody, you know, and now oligarchs, well, if they're still here, but they, you know, they were, but they were just this girl's fields. So she was married off at the age of 12. She was kind of auctioned off like a broodmare to
the lack of equality is appalling.
Yeah. But fortunately, her husband was a decent guy. But when he died, so that we're in the early 18th century, then it became like literally like something out of Bram Stoker or Sheridan Le Fanu or something. She was date raped. She was married off by a priest who was sort of in her wake. And it took years and years and years to reclaim this money from this guy who had, you know, abducted her, kidnapped her, raped her. And then in the end, she was placed in, she was deemed to be a lunatic, because the really good way of getting the money away from these women was to say that they were mentally unfit and to just lock them away. And you read people like Wilkie Collins and you think, oh, come on. But it was true. It was all true. These were the things that were happening. So, yeah.
And the man had the right, to do that.
Yes, because the legal system was run by men, for men. Women had no voice. Women had no voice when it came to their children. The men could hold the children as bargaining chips. That was a really good trick. But gradually, by degrees, from kind of the 1840s and what have you, you started to get this movement toward, as I say, a semblance of legal equality. It had to be done by men, but of course, some of the men were sympathetic to women. And this is not an anti-man rant, but it was just the law and the way it was. And you got, you know, 18th century England was a gambler society. It was a gambler society. Everyone, the gamblers were the prime minister, everybody gambled. So the biggest gamble of all was to risk your life, because you would have ended up on the gallows, and some of them did, seizing a girl off the street, raping her, making her yours, forcibly marrying, and then if you could get her pregnant, you were usually home and dry, because she didn't want to be, you know, lose her husband and be a sort of abandoned wife. So they are horror stories, really. I had to kind of rein it back a bit, because I thought, my God, the poor reader is going to be, you know, when you read about them running needles into their wives' tongues to get the last bit of money that she's managed to withhold from him and all this. And of course, it became the stuff of fiction. William Thackeray wrote about one of these women, Wilkie Collins, as I say, and Jane Austen. Jane Austen writes about elopement and the balance between love and marriage, and, you know, all those things. So I reference quite a lot of that in the book, and quite enjoyed doing that.
You do bring in a lot of the literary points, and I enjoyed them because it is the era's fiction bouncing off of the reality of the day. And while you might have pulled back, I can promise anybody who buys the book that you will be horrified at, and I'm a historian. I've read about these things before, but you really captured the detail of what was going on. Talk about Gretna Green for a minute. You'd almost be, a lot of these, as you've suggested, a lot of these guys were adventurers, not in a good sense of the word. And you'd almost be tempted to view this as a comedic thing if people's lives hadn't been on the line. But Gretna Green was part of the legal imbroglio around making all of this work.
Yeah, exactly, because you had, they did, well, parliamentarians never wanted to change the laws because a lot of them were doing this. They were abducting, well, not date rape and all that kind of thing, but they were marrying off young women who had large fortunes and using it to advance their political careers. So they were very reluctant the Commons were very reluctant to change the law. The House of Lords, whose daughters these were, wanted to change the law. So you had that. But eventually, 1753, they did bring in an act that would regulate all this a bit, but they left out Scotland. So there became this roaring trade in, I don't know how familiar the phrase Gretna Green is to Americans. I'm sure it is familiar, but it certainly features in Jane Austen. It was the nearest place over the border with England where you could go and get married. And there used to be a blacksmith, and there used to be, the blacksmith would conduct weddings. And you got all these dodgy priests who they were terrible. They had an eye to the main church. They all hot-footed it up to Gretna Green to start doing these marriages. And it does feature in Pride and Prejudice when Lydia is abducted by Wickham. And they say, have they gone to Scotland? Oh, please God, they've got to Scotland, because if they hadn't got to Scotland, she was ruined completely. But there is a comedic aspect to it, and like the plays of Sheridan and everything, they talk about elopement. You can imagine a romantic young girl. I can imagine myself, sort of think, oh my God, how thrilling to be abducted by these men who had a kind of rock star gleam about them, as I say. They had to be attractive, like Wickham, and going off to Gretna Green and being chased, and it was all in the newspapers, and people used to line the roads and clap like it was almost like a red carpet. At the same time, it did have a more, as you say, a much more serious aspect to it. And the last big case was kind of just before the reign of Queen Victoria, when a girl was abducted, and she it was terrible for her. She had a trial where the guy was put on trial, but in familiar, she was the one who sort of bore the opprobrium, the kind of victim blaming, victim shaming, all those things were coming out. Those things aren't new. The victim shaming isn't new. No, it was quite often, but the girl wanted this dashing young man. The public were always on the side of the guys. They knew they shouldn't be, but they couldn't help it. They were like this was Mick Jagger taking off some dull girl who happened to have money. Why should she have money? All the envy coming out and everything. So it was, the reaction was interesting.
And you say that the public were generally on the side of the guys, but the guys were pretty horrible. William Wesley Pole comes to mind.
He was shocking. I mean, he was the nephew of the Duke of Wellington. So he was, and the girl, Catherine Tilney Long, who was being pursued by the man who became William IV. And had she married William IV, you would probably have had no Queen Victoria, because she was nubile and able to have children. And that's an interesting counterfactual. But instead, she married the sexy nephew of the Duke of Wellington. And he was a very, very, what interested me was the psychology of it, really. This kind of, you felt there was a latent resentment in these men, that although they could marry the woman and get pretty much everything, whatever, they tried to squirrel bits away, but it was hard to do. That they could get more or less everything and get the women in their power. But you did feel this kind of, even though they had the money, it was, why should I even have to do that? Why has this woman got the money in the first place? Of course, they weren't all like that. This is, some of these marriages were happy. Usually when they were in the upper classes. It was usually when they were aristocrats marrying aristocrats, and the women were, as it were, as I say, doubly glazed against, double layers of protection. But these girls who'd inherited money through what they, that ridiculous thing in England when they say, oh, it's from trade, oh gosh, how awful. They had a kind of class, almost inferiority complex. I know it's ridiculous, but they did. So marrying into the Duke of Wellington's family, and she felt a little bit subservient to him, and he could play on that. And the rage in these men really interested me, because it was over and above. It really was. They felt the money should be theirs. It really ought to be theirs. And the women, oh, you just think, why? Why are you marrying this man? For God's sake, woman, just, nobody's that fanciable. I would, be typing in a rage. But, there it is. Love. Oh. Love.
Well, and at the same time, you do point out somebody from the 18th century who was a woman with agency, and that's Margaret, the second Duchess of Portland. Talk about her for a minute.
Yes, well, this is what I say about being doubly insulated in a way, because she was aristocracy, and she married an aristocrat, and their son became the prime minister. And it was all, you sort of think, yes, now why couldn't it always be like that? If you're going to be privileged, at least enjoy it. But she was a very interesting woman. I don't know if people know Oxford Street, which is the kind of shopping thoroughfare that runs through the middle of London. Mary Davies owned, of course. Mary Davies owned more or less everything south of Oxford Street, in the central. Margaret Portland owned everything more or less to the north, so things like Harley Street. These were all these names, Harley, Portland, Cavendish, they're all still there in the street names. But she was an educated woman. She was a woman of the Enlightenment. She was, her mind was, she was the, you do get women in this book. It isn't all doom and gloom or, as I say, Bram Stoker. You do get women who knew how to value their money and how to do something significant with it. And she was really the one that I alighted upon because of the contrast with Mary Davies. Mary Davies was like this creature of schism and the Tudor era and you felt all the turbulence of the era in her almost. Margaret was, as I say, a creature of the Enlightenment, of the age of rationality, and you felt her mind was a beautifully ordered thing. So you come back to this thing really in the book, because you can't, just because they all had money, that doesn't mean they're all the same, to state the obvious. And how much of it is externals and how much of it is character, and how some of these women bore what I call the heiress's burden, whereby they were plagued by the need to find their own intrinsic worth when they had so much extrinsic worth, and the women who were able to do that. That also interested me. How they all handled it. How many of them did come a cropper? How much truth there is in the phrase "poor little rich girl." It's a cliche, but there's a lot of truth in it. But I also I tried to relish the ones who didn't fall into that, rather, the Hogarthian descent. It isn't always like that, I'm glad to say.
So I'm just looking at the time, and I'm thinking I'd like to skip forward a little bit for all of, most of our audiences from the United States. And so let's talk a little bit about the dollar princesses, which is something that we both have some knowledge of. And of course, Consuelo Vanderbilt is probably one of the best known of those. But I leave you to take up where you'd like with the dollar princesses, who are all of those American heiresses who needed to trade up in terms of their desire to be part of a real aristocracy. Their families fancied that they were part of an American aristocracy, but they needed to prove it somehow by marrying into a real English aristocracy. So where would you like to start with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I defer to you somewhat on this, Peter, because you're the man who knows Newport, and you're the, I mean, I wish we'd talked before I wrote the book, because it's, I mean, Alva Vanderbilt fascinated me so much, and she did in a way become to me a kind of feminist heroine, because what arena could you conquer in those days? It had to be the social arena, and she surely did, and then of course became a suffragist and all of the, took up all that, which fascinated me, trying to find the link between those two sections of her life, as it were. But I know she was probably frightful and everything, but I kind of admired her. I really did. What do you think?
You do kind of have to admire Alva. She comes from pretty humble beginnings, and marries into a great family, and then, as you point out, engineers her rise up the social ladder. And she's an absolutely horrible person in terms of pawning her daughter off to somebody who only wants her for her money. But then she's got this other side, which is the suffragist side. And although I have always fancied that was Alva saying, "You are not going to dismiss me in the voting booth," but she pursues it quite energetically and selflessly too. And there's a lot of there's great photographs and history around that as well. So Alva is a fascinating person, if not always a likable one.
I did feel that, and I did. Consuelo, as I say, I'm very far from being the first person to write, but what I tried to do was keep the train running, as it were. So I couldn't stop too long on any of these people. So Consuelo also fascinated me, because she is the symbol, if you like, of the she gets the title, he gets the roof fixed, everybody's happy except nobody is, kind of thing. Although some of those marriages were happy. I mean, Mary later, I don't know how you say it, who married George Curzon, who became Foreign Secretary, and who was the father-in-law of Oswald Mosley, who married one of the Mitford. I mean, that was a really, really happy marriage, although she did nevertheless write home to America saying, don't send these girls over here. You've no idea what it's like trying to. But I mean, they were sponsored by the Prince of Wales. That was the main thing, wasn't it? Really, that Edward VII, the man who adored women. He adored American women. I'm sure they livened the place up no end, and they were much better dressed and much less miserable, and could talk about things other than horse racing and whatever. And they were fun. They must have been fabulous, I think. People like Consuelo.
Yes. I think Consuelo is fascinating, and you took her out of Newport for me. I sort of lose track of her after she leaves Newport, but she is fascinating because she does gain some of her own agency later in life. These things that her mother did to her, she did to her when she was a teenager. I mean, she married her off to the Duke when she was a teenager. And later in life, she has the gumption to get a divorce. She goes off and marries for love and lives in France. And really does sort of has a reckoning both with her mother and with her past. And you have to admire her for that personally. She did not accept this passively, and she didn't really accept the marriage passively either.
No, not at all. I mean, in a way, I know it's heresy. I almost felt more sorry for him, because the Duke of Marlborough, who also was in love, but they were both in love with somebody else when they walked up the aisle together. But arranged marriages are, they are a thing. I know nowadays we regard it as anathema and all that. And it did keep reminding me a little bit of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer a bit,
Mm-hmm.
although Consuelo ended far more happily, I'm glad to say. But that kind of almost performative misery that onlookers could relate to and could turn him into a hate figure. And he ended up almost driven insane by it, really, the Duke of Marlborough. How, like when she went off and became a councillor for the,
Mm-hmm.
for the Progressive Party, and all you felt kind of jabs at him in a way, even though she was also, I'm sure, sincere about it. So she kind of took us into a new, in the book I say she's kind of the last woman of whom we know who was married off in that way, the last heiress who really did not have the power of choice. From then on, when they made choices that were bad, it was on them, really.
Mm-hmm.
And they sure did. But she, the fact that she founded a hospital in Paris with Winnaretta Singer, anyway, that felt like the new era sort of being ushering in, really.
And that does transition through her life. She's, she almost represents the 16th and 17th century in what happens to her. And yet she bridges straight into the 20th century, quite literally, married in 1895. She bridges into the 20th century and is one of these women who does have agency and can determine her own fate, and does. And so, as you point out, after that, they're making bad decisions on their own. So why don't we talk about somebody who was really infamous for bad decisions, and that would be Barbara Hutton.
Barbara. Poor Barbara. Yes.
Poor Barbara.
Again, I did. I felt, because, again, I'm hardly the first person to write about her, but she became almost totemic within the book, because she is, for us, I feel, the ultimate symbol of the what I call the Hogarthian descent. The girl who, quite literally had everything from $50+ million to physical attraction to a cultured mind, etc., and yet ticks every heiress bingo, if you like, the mother who committed suicide, the unloving father, the problems with alcohol dependency, drug dependency, functioning anorexic, blah, blah, and of course the marriages, and of course the slow decline of the fortune. So you can't help, I kind of refer back to her throughout the book, because she has such symbolic weight. And her psychology, I suppose by that time, when in the 19th century, I think she was the Duchess of Manchester. Well, she was a duchess twice over. So, what the hell? She said, women talk about rights. All I know is I have no wrongs. It's like almost Oscar Wilde. And they had no concept at all, really, of guilt or feeling that there might be something wrong with a system whereby they have many millions and other people haven't got enough to eat. They're not bad people. They just don't seem to know. And by the time of Barbara, you do know, unless you're a complete moron, which she was not. And you do start to get this sense of guilt, this kind of masochistic almost desire to offload it all. When she's arraigned for the Woolworth shop girls are on strike for $20 a week or something, and she, it's you know that she knows, that she almost masochistically makes herself a mark for all this kind of thing. That was how I felt about it. As equality grows nearer and nearer, we're not there, but you know what I mean. You just feel the psychology of the heiress starts to shift, and they do bring the troubles on themselves, almost like an internal sense of this isn't quite right. Of course, they weren't all like that. Daisy Fellows loved it. She loved being rich. She slept with everybody. She had a terrible life as well, but she didn't care. She enjoyed it. She was a predator. Barbara was prey. You know, it's like Margaret Portland and Mary Davies again. You know, you can't. There are things you can't explain. But she, you know.
There were those like Doris Duke who were sort of halfway in between. Doris could be prey. She was never, I would say, a predator, but she also had and was seen as somewhat of a rival to Barbara Hutton. They inherited, they were about the same age, they inherited at about the same time. And yet Doris, Barbara died basically without money, and Doris gave away something like $400 million over the course of her lifetime and left $1.2 billion to charity, which continues to do good work as the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And certainly had fun with her money and certainly had tragic times. One of her good friends who I was very close to in Newport said that, and I think this is true with all of the heiresses, she said Doris's greatest asset was her money, and it was also her greatest source of trials and tribulations. She never quite knew who to trust, which is also common with heiresses. And by the way, this friend was part of the Leiter family. So once again, all of these circles come back together. So
oh God, yeah. I mean, it really did sometimes. I mean, there's one who I kind of loved, Dorothy Paget, the woman who was the biggest racehorse owner in this country before the Queen, and she won the Derby and all this, and she enjoyed her money, but she was related to the Whitneys and the Vanderbilts and also to the British aristocracy, so she had it on all sides. But she was one of the ones who did enjoy it. You did, as I say, you did sort of take a bit of a breath of relief when they knew how to enjoy it, because you know, and Daisy Fellows, who, as I say, occurs repeatedly in the letters of people like Nancy Mitford. I mean, she was just a blast. She was much the most fun bit to write about, because she had no fear. No, I mean, like Barbara, she never ate. I said she had the diet of Keith Richards circa 1973, cocaine and a bit of cold grouse or something. And she looked great in clothes. She was amused to Schiaparelli. She was amused to Chanel. She made passes at everyone. They usually succumbed. And on paper, she had an awful life. Two of her daughters were accused of collaborating with the Germans in the Second World War. One of her daughters predeceased her. As I say, her mother killed herself. Her first husband killed himself. Her second husband was a twit who went bankrupt. But you never felt she was a victim. So there was something quite reassuring about writing about her, really. And Winnaretta, her aunt, you know, the role of the arts patron was also very fascinating. But she was...
And I loved the chapter about Paris with all of these women who were, some of them lesbian, some of them not, but they had found great agency, and in a certain period in Paris, there was great freedom for them, and they were a fascinating group. They really were. And Winnaretta was one of them.
Yes, I mean a slightly older generation, but yes, absolutely. This extraordinary house she had in Paris and a palazzo in Venice. I mean, you know, that's what to do with your money. If you're going to hold on to it, do that with it. And also this drawing room in Paris, which of course is in kind of the model for in Proust, you know, the salon in Proust in À la Recherche. It looks the size of a car park, really. And she put it to proper use, you know. Poulenc premiered there, Ravel, Debussy, you know. She was a patron of the arts. She had Diaghilev, all this glorious, the first flowerings of modernism, and you just longed to be there, didn't you?
Yes.
Oh God!
And the people with whom they were associating, it was some of the great writers and artists and musicians and composers, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, but I don't mean. Yeah, no, go on. You say, Peter.
No. You go. You're up.
Well, Well, I don't mean to overstate this thing of being women who love other women, but it did feel for people like Natalie Barney and Winnaretta that they could achieve a kind of design for living that enabled them to separate. I mean, Winnaretta did marry her first husband. You know the story of how she spent the night on the top of the wardrobe. If you come near me, I'll kill you. But he was a prince, so that was handy. And then she married a gay man, so that worked very, very well. And slept with loads of women, a lot of them married. And it sounds, like she was she really did have agency. And Natalie the same. This design for living that enabled you to separate marriage and money, which even as the law was changing and becoming more equitable for women, nevertheless, Barbara Hutton managed to lose a hell of a lot of money on those husbands, other than Cary Grant, didn't she? I mean, the other six. Yeah. Separated, go on.
And Alva did too. Alva Vanderbilt's died in, I think, 32 or 33. And her accountant made a remark that it was a good thing that she had died when she did, because in another 8 months she would have been penniless. So it's not uncommon for people with money to spend it out of existence. It's quite common, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, because you have, as I say in the introduction, which was the hardest bit to write, but I was intent on getting that kind of the way I wanted it. Not that the rest isn't, but you know what I mean, setting out my stall, as it were. And I talk about when they say money doesn't bring happiness, and you sort of think, oh, come on, you know. It's and I'm, a relatively very privileged person, don't get me wrong. But if I was suddenly given $1 million, I would be much happier. I really would. I mean, I just would. But it's that thing, and I started to think about this, what I call the blank sumptuous similarity of their days, and the lack of context. There's no context. There's no knowledge of what it's like not to have money. There's no sense of it being a shaft of light upon an ordinary life. There's no concept of normal. You just feel, just be normal for 5 minutes, and you'll be a lot happier. But how can they be? And and I did, although part of me wrote this in a frustrated sense of, oh, come on, woman, another part of me really did sympathize and kind of start to absorb that sense of, I might plan to go to Venice and it will be the highlight of my year. Well, it means nothing to them. They could live at the Cipriani and they've probably got a Canaletto on the wall. So nothing, how do you find the meaning? Where is the meaning? Hence, this hunger for the sense of being hungry, as it were, which expresses itself emotionally, and this sense, this existential, where is my worth when I have so much worth, as it were? Who am I within the couture? And with people like Barbara, you do feel with that. I mean, marrying Rubirosa, for God's sake. I mean, how could you do that? And that's just
Ruby, as he was known, was infamous. And let's be frank. This is a first world story. It's a first world problem.
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, I think we all have this thought that, well, if I only had the money, everything would be easy. And quite frankly, it's not. And there were as many stories that didn't end well as did. And we need to end well too right now. But before we do in a minute, I just thought I loved your epilogue, because you started off by saying it doesn't have to be this way. And you talked about Angela Burdett. You want to talk about her for like 30 seconds?
Oh, she's my heroine. She is my heroine. She was the woman who acquired a banking fortune in 1837, the same year that Queen Victoria came to the throne, and became a kind of alternative Queen of England, because she regarded her fortune in the way that I suppose Victoria did, or should have regarded, yes, she did, a destiny. and she regarded it as her duty to do something with this money that would signify not to squander it, not to fritter it, not to, there is a coda to the story, which is of interest, but she remained single and formed a kind of platonic love affair with Charles Dickens, who also had a highly developed social conscience. And she just did good. She was a sublime and serious philanthropist. She helped the Irish potato famine. She helped animals. She helped what were called fallen women, establishing a home for prostitutes to try and help them. That she did that with Dickens. She just was, she took on the burden and she tried to do what was right with it. And I just love her. I just love Angela so much. She's a fascinating and a beautiful soul, I think.
And with that, I'd like to ask Jennifer to come back up, and we can do a little Q&A. So please remember to, if you've got some questions, put them down, hit the ask a question thing. And hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Jennifer.
Can we just go on for another hour or so? This is so delightful and so fascinating.
Well, I don't want to give away the whole book. I want people to buy it.
Right, of course.
Not that we've done anything more than delve into it. It's a wonderful book, and it's endlessly fascinating.
Well, and I would like to point out, since you brought it up, I was going to toward the end, but it looks like there was a trouble with the link that we had initially posted in the chat. So Jacques has posted a more recent and updated link that hopefully people will be able to use. And we do appreciate everybody's efforts to purchase the book and appreciate that support. So hopefully things will go more smoothly for you all now using that second link. So thank you, Jacques, for that. As I so often do, I'm going to invoke host privilege and pose kind of a question of my own. For Laura, you are so funny. You are super funny. And did you approach all of this? It sounds like you approached a story that could have been approached in many different ways with that sense of humor kind of firmly in hand.
That's so lovely. Thank you. Well, you know the English, they always try to sort of offset tragedy with humor. It's a national, I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But yes, it is quite I did try to write it with a kind of lightness. I did, and to bring in, what I was quite keen on doing was bringing in contemporary references, and like when I say about Keith Richard, I mean it's silly, but you know what I mean. Or bring in Meghan and Harry, or bring in, you know, I do try and keep it as a sort of modern feel, I hope, which I suppose sometimes means jokes, I hope, partly because what Peter and I have been talking about, you can imagine some of it has an innately depressing aspect to it. Sure. You know, when you're reading for women and also for, you know, enlightened men, to read about the way these women lived is not a happy thing. And of course, I don't ever make light of that. I mean, quite the opposite. I get quite angry with it. I suppose I have an emotional engagement with it. You know, I don't try to remain too dispassionate. You know, when I'm angry about something, I sort of say so. Although it's not about me, but you know what I mean. I don't worry about remaining too disinterested. And some of these people were a blast. Daisy Fellows was a total blast. Also, who we haven't talked about, the social hostesses in London in the interwar period, the kind of Emerald Cunard we did mention, and also Mrs. Greville. I mean, she's priceless. She was an illegitimate brewing heiress. So even during the Depression, her fortune was bomb-proof because it was beer. And she became a fairly, as I said, like with the salon, the domestic sphere was where they exerted power, because, you know, it wasn't so easy just to go out and become prime minister or anything. I mean, those things were not possible. So they had power in the domestic sphere and political power. Mrs. Greville had too much so, really, when you're inviting people like von Ribbentrop and you're also inviting the future Edward VIII. You know, some people thought this was pretty dodgy, and with very good reason. But it was really the way people wrote about them. You know, people like Eva. You know, if you can quote Nancy Mitford and Evelyn Waugh, you know, they're doing quite a lot of the lifting for you, to be perfectly honest, because they're always so on the money and so engaged with this society. And then, of course, Emerald Cunard's daughter was Nancy Cunard, who is the first of what I describe as the rebel heiresses, this sense of guilt about what they have, which with Nancy and of course people like Patty Hearst became it was not just something internalized. It was real, and Nancy Cunard became a political activist. She was an serious, and she really lived her politics in a very serious way, and she was. And this is the daughter of Emerald Cunard. So that contradiction and that I mean, there's nothing funny about Nancy. She was a serious and very impressive and ultimately tragic individual. But you just try and suit the star to the subject, I suppose. But you know, there are about 20 books in there in a way. I mean, yes. Somebody else could write far more about Nancy Cunard, and I'm sure has done. But as I say, I'm just trying to keep the train rolling, as it were.
So thank you for that. That was a fantastic answer. And our friend Joan Walden in the chat says, some writers are good at writing, but not at speaking. Laura evidently is great at both. And I think we all concur. So thank you, Joan, for that.
Oh, that's so lovely. Goodness me. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it.
Before we move on to the audience's questions, I would be remiss if I didn't invite Peter to spend 30 seconds. You mentioned Charles Dickens just a moment ago. Peter, would you like to share the Mark Twain, Charles Dickens connection?
Oh, yes. So Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, took his future wife out on their first date with her parents, of course, because we are talking about the 19th century. And their first date was to go see Charles Dickens speak in New York City. So, and then he wrote about it for a newspaper article that he was writing. But imagine taking your future wife on your first date to see Charles Dickens speak.
I think that's a great first date. I would marry that.
I would
marry that man. My God, fantastic!
Same. Thank you, Peter, for sharing that.
I remember going to an exhibition at, was it J.P. Morgan, the museum or something? And it was all about Charles Dickens in America. I had no idea about any of that. That's real ignorance on my part. But that he was quite a star in America.
He was, and he did, I think, was it one or two different speaking tours here? And he had a real love-hate relationship with the speaking tours. And Twain, of course, spoke all over the world, and he too had a real love-hate relationship with it. He hated the touring. He hated being, I'm talking about Twain now, he hated being away from his family, but I think he loved the interaction with the audience. He genuinely enjoyed being able to make people laugh. So.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Audience member Beth Lehman wants to know, did Queen Victoria have any influence on the better treatment of women over time? Thanks.
Right. What a good question. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that in a very, that's a historian's question in a way. I mean, the legislation happened during her reign, which is not quite the same thing. You know, there were people like Caroline Norton, who was a great reformer for women, who advanced the women who to have access to their children, that the men couldn't just take the children away when the marriages broke up and all that. And then later you had the 1870 and the 1882 Married Women's Property Acts, which are the legal direction of traffic was going in the right way, if you like. And you also had people like Elizabeth Gaskell, who were great campaigners. A lot of middle class women were very vocal campaigners for the rights of women. But as I said, the aristocracy, where it didn't really touch them, and by that time they had their own system of kind of private equity, whereby their fortunes could be kept safe. They could keep theirs safe. And everyone else wanted that for all the other women, but it didn't, it was really a middle class movement as much as anything. So Queen Victoria It's a really good question, and I wish I could answer it with real historian's authority, but all I can say is it happened when she was on the throne. I'm not sure how profoundly engaged she would have been with it. I mean, can you add anything to that, Peter?
I think you're correct. From what I know about Victoria, I don't think that she would have stepped out of that zone, but that's a guess on my part. I'm not an expert on Victoria either.
Yeah,
I think that's very good.
I think
answer.
I think that sort of circumscription that the royal family feels about certain things, I don't think she would have stepped out of that very thoroughly.
So. I've just seen in the chat a lady saying she did not believe at all in women's rights. I defer to that. I know she was very jealous of Angela Burdett-Coutts, the great philanthropist, because when Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, so 1897, and Angela had a house on Piccadilly, and she came to her window, and all the crowd sort of, there's the Queen, and that was Angela, not Victoria. So doubt that went down terribly well. But that's a very interesting question. Very, very interesting question.
Thank you, Beth. We're running out of time. We might run a minute over because we have at least two more questions. I'm going to address one that's not for Laura or Peter, though. Betsy says she wasn't able to join at the start. Will a recording be available? And yes, as I had mentioned at the beginning, this program will be available in its entirety, either by coming back the way you got here or going to marktwainhouse.org and finding the program on the Mark Twain House's website. So please look for it there. Joe Fodor says, did Dorothy Paget's, am I saying that right? Paget? Did her famous reclusiveness pose any problems in getting at what she was really like? Were there many who had firsthand knowledge of her and were willing to talk? Thanks for your question, Joe.
Okay. Dorothy Paget, as in the racehorse owner, are we talking about? I wonder.
Joe, can you say in the chat whether that's who you mean? While we wait for Joe, I'm going to move to a different question. Yes, okay. Joe says yes, that's who he means. Thanks, Joe.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. She was an eccentric. She was hugely fat. She wore the same tweed coat whether she went to Royal Ascot or to some sort of winter race meeting or whatever. And she kind of was nocturnal. She used to ring her racehorse trainers in the middle of the night and say, I think you should do this, 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 and this. Ring her bookmakers in the middle of the night and place bets on races that had already taken place, quite often losing bets. And how I know of her is because I used to live in Newmarket, the racehorse centre. So how I know of her is just as an eccentric, and again a lesbian. So again, you had that separation of marriage and money. But I don't know more about her than that, to be perfectly honest. She features in my book as an example of someone who just enjoyed their money, or did something with their money, didn't fritter their money, did something. She only features in passing, to be perfectly honest.
Fair enough.
Sorry, that's not a terribly full answer, but that's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
I think that was perfect. And I think we'll take just one more, and this is something we talked about briefly in the green room just before we got started today. Have you seen The Gilded Age?
Is that to me? I haven't. Yeah,
I thought you said you had not, but
no, I haven't seen it. But you have, haven't you, Peter?
I've only seen one episode. We decided to. We're closed on Tuesdays here at the museum, and we decided on Tuesdays for lunch we would watch episodes in the auditorium. So I've only gotten to see one, but I enjoyed it. I thought there were things about it historically that were on the money, and I thought there were things that maybe weren't quite so much. But it's a drama series. The costuming is lovely and lavish. I think New York looks a little too clean. But other than that, there is a prevailing attitude that I think is appropriate. it was not a very nice society. It was extremely exclusive. As you put in your book, Laura, it was more English than the English in its exclusivity, except that the ancient families were Dutch in origin, like Caroline Schermerhorn Astor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it get that Astor v. Vanderbilt kind of dynamic? Does it get that right, do you think? Or?
A little bit. They are kind of casting in the Russell family versus the whoever the main snooty family is, the Dutch family that they've named there. They're sort of actually casting them as the Astors and the Vanderbilts when it comes right down to it. The Vanderbilts were very new money as far as Caroline Astor was concerned. She actually makes a statement that that you ought to have at least 3 generations of wealth before you're even considered for high society. And in the Vanderbilt's case, she's not quite so sure. And it's one of my favorite quotes about the Gilded Age does come from Edith Wharton, who writes a letter in which she says, why must the Vanderbilts retard culture so very thoroughly? They are engaged in a sort of Thermopylae of bad taste from which it is assumed they shall never recover. Well, actually, they have recovered from it, but nonetheless, it's an interesting expression from somebody who was right there at the source, Edith Wharton.
Thank you for that, Peter.
Right, funny.
So we're all going to be busy reading Heiresses. And we've had such a good time with you here this afternoon. So we all want to know, what's your next project? What are you going to come talk about with us next time?
Oh, you are so lovely. I would so love that. I don't have one. I've been writing I hope to have one soon. I've been writing a script. I've been doing some screenwriting, which I have to say I kind of loved, because it's a lot fewer words than in that book. That book did knock me out a bit, I've got to be honest, not to be sort of precious about it, but it was, as I said, much the hardest book I've ever written. And there is so many people, so I was rewriting another book for reissue and doing this screenwriting, and I am an author in search of a subject, Jennifer, so feel free to offer me something.
Please keep us posted. I
will. I really will.
And again, this has been such a delight. We hope you will not be a stranger, that you will, in fact, consider yourself a friend of the Mark Twain House and Museum. And I know that Peter would second that, right, Peter?
Yes. When you're over here, we would love to give you a behind-the-scenes tour of the house. So.
Oh, gosh, that would be so nice. I really appreciate it.
And meantime, folks, Jacques has just reposted the link by which you can purchase this book. I believe we have book plates coming to put inside these books. So you do get a signed copy, which again is something you don't get elsewhere. And of course, your purchase does support the work of the Mark Twain House and Museum. So click that button. And thank you both so much. What a delightful way to spend the lunch hour. And let's do it again soon.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I've loved it. Thank you.
And thank you, audience, for your great questions. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
see you next time.
Bye-bye.